Old Testament Survey Lesson 17. We are wandering in the wilderness today with the Israelites in the book of Numbers. The author of the book is Moses, the man of God, and we are in the wilderness around 1451 BC ish to somewhere around 1440 BC at the beginning of the writing of this book. And by the end, we should be somewhere around 1410 to 1406. So that's the time period. All of those estimates are a little bit circa, a little bit close. The realm of the role of the tabernacle and priesthood in keeping the fire of Jehovah burning in Israel. It's the same theme as Exodus. The idea here is Israel has just turned their back on the promise of God. And because they turned their back on the promise of God, God has to go with them through the wilderness for 40 years, and he has to keep them uh, unified with each other and with him. So the tabernacle has never been more important. The tabernacle in Israel will be important, but the tabernacle in the wilderness becomes the center of the camp. We will see them arrange the camp in chapter 2 in formation around the tabernacle. If the tabernacle and the priesthood are not the focus of the Israelites in the wilderness, they will never enter the promised land. Okay. The key verse in Numbers is Numbers 14:21. Numbers 14:21, I'm going to flip over there and read it to you, says, "But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord." This is God speaking. But as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. The Israelites have just come to a place in the wilderness where they said, we'd rather stay in the desert than go fight the Canaanites. That's that's what's about to happen. Numbers is named Numbers because of the two censuses taken at the beginning and end of the Israelites' time in the wilderness. This book tells the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. In Genesis, man is created to walk with God, but wanders from him. In Exodus, we see a story of redemption and restoration of fellowship. In Leviticus, the worship of the redeemed, and in Numbers, the renewal, walking in fellowship with God. Okay. So let's talk about the Israelites in their preparation to conquer the promised land. At the beginning of this book, everything appears to be going according to plan. The first 12 chapters of this book are the preparation to conquer the promised land. Okay. Then in chapters 13 and 14, the generation of Israelites that came out of the wilderness fail to conquer the promised land. Then, for 11 chapters, in chapters 15 through 25, a generation lives outside the promise. And then, 26 through 36, again 11 chapters, a new generation prepares to conquer the promised land. So, Numbers chapter 1 begins with the numbering of the people for war. Again, this book is called Numbers because the men of war were numbered twice. It's interesting, isn't it, that this numbering of the people is not a census of the entire camp or the entire nation. They're not counting everyone, okay? They're counting the number of the armies of the tribes of Israel. They're counting the fighting men. Uh, Notice they don't count the Levites. If you look at Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, it says, And the Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of the congregation on the first day of the second month in the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Take ye the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel after their families by the house of their fathers, with the number of their names, every male, no females, by their polls, from 20 years old and upward, all that are able to go forth to war in Israel, thou and Aaron shall number them by their names. And with you there shall be a man of every tribe, every one head of the house of his fathers. Okay? So, why would you number an army? Indeed. But didn't David get in trouble for doing the same thing? Yeah, so it's interesting that God told Moses to number the people, and God punished David for doing it on his own initiative without being told, right? What do you think might be the reason why Moses was told to number the people at the beginning and end of the wilderness wanderings? That's an interesting suggestion. Show the growth. Except they didn't grow, they shrunk. In the second numbering, there were nearly the same number of people, but actually a few less. Um, I think the reason is God knew what was going to happen at Kadesh Barnea. God knew the Israelites in this generation were going to turn him down. I'm positive that God knew, but I think that's the reason for the numbering. God wanted to be able to show future generations of Israelites and Christians it wasn't the size of the army because roughly the same number of soldiers, but actually a few more, could have gone in and conquered the land 40 years earlier, but instead they, in unbelief, rejected the promise. They said, We're not a big enough army, but a smaller army accomplished the task. So I think that would be the reason. Um, Chapter 1 also introduces the idea of a prince or a ruler over the tribes. So, for example, Eliezer, the son of Shadur, is the prince of the tribe of Simeon. Judah is led by Nahshon, the son of Amminadab. Okay, um, it's interesting that as they were being numbered, there does appear to be someone missing, right? Reuben is the oldest of the sons of Jacob, After him, you'll see Simeon, and after Simeon, you'll see Judah. But didn't Jacob and Leah have a son between Simeon and Judah? The answer is yes, by the way. He was. So Reuben, Simeon, number three is missing. Judah. Who's number three? It was Levi. Yeah, the Levites were not numbered because the Levites would not go to war because they are priests between God and man. So in verse 16, it says of these were the renowned of the congregation, princes of the tribes of their fathers, heads of thousands in Israel. Okay. Um, in all of this, they begin then to list the numbers of each tribe. So verse 20 begins with Reuben, Israel's eldest son by their generations, and it says that they polled everyone 20 years old and upward, everyone who was able to go to war. And in verse 21, it gives the number 40 and 6,500. This process is repeated for each of the sons of Jacob. Verse 32, Joseph. Verse 33, Manasseh or Ephraim. Verse 34, Manasseh. That's interesting. Joseph, namely the children of Ephraim. Verse 32. So, guys, this is really important. When Joseph brought his two sons to Jacob, and Jacob adopted them, Joseph was not given three portions in Israel. He was given two portions. Joseph, all his other children, were numbered with the tribe of Ephraim. Ephraim was his portion. Manasseh was his double portion because he was treated by Jacob as the heir. Okay. Um, And when you get to the bottom with Benjamin, 30 and 5,400, then for some reason we're not done because now all of a sudden he goes to the children of Dan, Asher, then Naphtali. Why do you think that Dan, Asher, and Naphtali would be last? I was hoping maybe one of you would know. Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. There were four sons of the bondservants, not three. That's what makes it odd. So they start with the oldest ones, right? Reuben, Simeon, Judah. But then all of a sudden, as they're numbering them, it doesn't go in that order. So if you look back at verse 21, Reuben, Simeon, then after Simeon is Gad, and then Judah. Gad seems to be inserted into the place where you would expect to find Levi. Um, And then Issachar, Zebulun, and the children of Joseph, and then the other three children of the concubines. I don't have a good answer for why it's in this order. Um, it doesn't even appear to be the order from north to south in the promised land according to their allotments. So I just think the order is interesting. It's one of those biblical anomalies that I'm sure there's a reason. I just haven't figured out what it is. Um, but as mentioned earlier, verse 49 specifically says, only thou shalt not number the tribe of Levi, neither take the sum of them among the children of Israel. Okay. But thou shalt appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony. So the Levites do not go to war. Do you think the other tribes might have thought that was convenient since Moses was a Levite? Mm-hmm. Um, Look at chapter 2 and the arrangement of the camp. It's incredible to me to see how this arrangement is actually set up. I showed pictures of the camp when we were studying Exodus and the camp, the tribes camped around the tabernacle. This is where it's described. You notice that on the east side, toward the rising of the sun, shall they of the standard of the camp of Judah pitch throughout their armies, and Nashon, the son of Amminadab, shall be captain of the children of Judah. Okay. Um, After him is Issachar. After him, verse 7, is Zebulun. After him, verse 9, there's Judah again. Except if you look at the numbers in verse 4 don't match the numbers in verse 9. So essentially, what he's saying is all of these tribes are under the banner of the house of Judah. Okay, so Judah, Nahshon, the son of Amminadab, captain of Judah, leads not only his 74,600, but he also leads the armies of Issachar. He also leads the armies of Zebulun, and together that numbers six four. I'm sorry, 180,000, 186,400 on the east side, led by Judah. Then on the south side, Reuben is the leader of the group, and Reuben's captain is Eliezer. And Eliezer not only leads Reuben, but he also leads Simeon and Gad, and all that are with Reuben are 100,050 and 1,450. So they're actually set up in four groups, and one tribe is given leadership over two other tribes. Um, the tabernacle of the congregation sets forward with the camp, in the midst of the camp. So whenever they are encamping as a war camp, they set forward the camp, the tabernacle. Now, when you get to the west side, we see Ephraim, and with Ephraim, we see verse 20, the tribe of Manasseh, as you might expect. But then in verse 22, Benjamin. So the three tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, and his younger brother Benjamin, are all together. And the total number that are with Ephraim are in 100,000, 8,000, and in 100 throughout their armies. And then on the north side is the camp of Dan. And their armies are led by Ahiezer. And Ahiezer leads also Asher and Naphtali. And they that were numbered in the camp of Dan were in 100,000 and 50 and 7,000 and 600. They shall go hindmost with their standards. Hindmost, that's interesting. It says that uh, the tribe of Dan is on the north side, but they go hindmost because of the direction from which the Israelites will enter the promised land, coming in from the east in the western direction, coming over the Jordan River, or coming really through it. Okay, um, but it makes a giant cross sign, three on each side, the tabernacle in the middle. If you're an eagle flying over it, it makes a giant cross. The other thing I think is interesting is that an organized camp like this, a war camp like this, with ensigns, flags, if you will, battle flags flying, do you think if you saw this camp moving in the direction of your city, that it would be intimidating? Yeah. Um, the other thing that's interesting is the total number of the camp is given in verse 32. Okay. These are those which were numbered of the children of Israel by the house of their fathers. All those that were numbered of the camps throughout their hosts were 600,000 and 3,550. So let's play fun with math. Going to grab a piece of scratch paper. So we are going to start this journey. Correct me if I'm reading this incorrectly, but it looks to me like we got 600 and 3,550. 603505, right? Okay, that's interesting. So what happens if I go toward the back of the book to find where they numbered the people again? Moses calls the people together and he says, it is time to number the people. We're in Numbers chapter 31. Okay. And the people are being numbered. And where's that number I'm looking for? I knew I should have written that down. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I'm looking in the wrong chapter. I just flipped too far forward. All right. So we are going to go back to chapter 26. And in chapter 26, we're going to see again in verse 4, they're taking the sum of the people from 20 years old and upward. They begin again with Reuben. They go on through the different families of the Israelites, and they begin to get their families numbered. Okay? What's interesting is they don't go through the whole process of listing out every single one of them like they have in the past. but they're just giving us an overview of how they go about the exact same process once again. Okay. If you look then down to verse 62, and those that were numbered of them were 20 and 3,000, all males from a month old and upward. Okay, we're talking specifically about the Levites. These are they that were numbered by Moses and Eleazar the priest, who numbered the children of Israel. So these are the numberers, all right? So how many people do you think we would have in total once we get all of these people numbered? So to get that answer, we're going to go back to verse 51, where the total number is. These were the numbered of the children of Israel, 600,000 and 1,730. So let's see. Once again, we have 600,000 and we have 1,730, right? Is that right? 600,000, 1,730. So if I subtract 601,730 from 603,505, what do you think I should get as my final number? It looks to me like the Israelites' manpower was reduced by 1,775. Is my math right? I'm sure so. You got what? Did you have 603,505? It's also possible I did the math wrong. 505, 548. Yeah, let me see. Because what I have is 550. Oh, you know what? You are correct. I transposed the last two digits. I have 505 instead of 550. Okay, so 0, 2, 8. Yep, 1,820. So 1,820 fewer men, but roughly the same number of fighting men. Okay. Um, so what was different? They did not have more men. God didn't get any more powerful. What was different? Yeah, I think if I were going to just try to summarize the difference, I would say it's obedience, or put another way, it's faith, right? They disobeyed because of their unbelief. And because of their unbelief, they didn't get what God wanted to give them. Um, yeah, God kept his promise to Abram, and Yet this generation in Numbers 2 didn't get to participate. God's plan will be fulfilled. Whether or not you will get to be a part of it is conditioned on your obedience. I think that was also the lesson of Esther. God was always going to save Israel from from the enemies, whether it's the Canaanites or it's Haman in Esther. God will always save Israel. Whether or not Esther got to be a part of it, well, that was up to her. Yeah. Okay, so that ends the fun with math. The arrangement of the priests and Levites is interesting. Sure. Hmm. Yeah, it's a mystery. Um, if one of you guys figures it out, please come back and let me know. I do find it interesting who the captains are on every side, right? You have you know, if you go back to chapter 2 and you start looking at who's lining up with whom in the order, on the east side it starts with Judah, and with Judah you have Issachar and Zebulun. Is there any particular connection between Issachar and Zebulun there? It's interesting. Then you go down and you look at Reuben, and you see with Reuben, um, you have Gad and uh, wait, I skipped one. Simeon, Simeon and Gad with Reuben. Okay. The only thing I can say is the first two. What comes to my mind is, well, Reuben is the actual firstborn, but Judah receives the leadership of the people of Israel in a prophetic prophecy, right? Judah is the one through whom Christ would come. Judah is the one through whom David would come. So you have basically um, the spiritual firstborn, Judah, the physical firstborn, Reuben, and the last one is Ephraim. And Ephraim is essentially said specifically to take the place of Joseph, who was Jacob's chosen as the firstborn, right? So you have three different claimants to the birthright in different ways. But what's interesting about that is in between them, you have um, this kind of missing thing because again, go back to the beginning. In verse 3, it starts with Judah, okay? And then it goes down, and the next one you see is Reuben next to Judah, right? And then next to Reuben, you find the tabernacle of the congregation in the midst of the camp. And on the west side is Ephraim. And with Ephraim, you have Benjamin and Manasseh. Okay. But then what about that last group, right? Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. Who in the world is Dan? Right? You can kind of make sense with 3 out of 4 of them. Well, these are the claimants to the birthright. And each one is given a portion of the army to lead. But why is Dan there? The answer is I haven't the foggiest idea. I, somebody had to lead that group, and God said it's going to be Dan. That's all I got. Okay. Um, you start to see a pattern develop with Reuben and Judah and Ephraim, but then Dan blows it up. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and um, it's interesting that you mentioned Dan being the firstborn of the concubine because one of the things that I had thought about is Gad seems to get substituted into the place that Levi would have held in the order, right? Um, so, what do Dan and Naphtali and Asher have in common? Okay, who was their mother? And right, and who was Dan's mother? Bilhah. So could it be that Dan is given leadership over the concubine sons because he was the firstborn of the concubines? And Gad isn't there because he was placed in Levi's place because Levi didn't go to war. I don't know that we're going to solve this one. I just think that's an interesting theory. Okay. Um, so that said, Let's go to Numbers chapter 3, and we begin to see the arrangement of the priests and the Levites in chapters 3 and 4. The families of Levi are spelled out in the first four verses, and it speaks of Aaron and Moses, and it speaks of the firstborn of Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and then his two younger sons, Eleazar and Ithamar. Nadab and Abihu are not here, right? Remember what happened to Nadab and Abihu yesterday? Uh, they died, right? So what we have left is Eleazar and Ithamar. And so they will minister in the priest's office with Aaron, and then Eleazar will become the high priest when Aaron is gone later in Numbers. Okay. The tribe of Levi is spelled out beginning in verse 5, and you begin to see some of the swap that Lauren alluded to earlier about the firstborn. In fact, let's just take a quick look at verses 11 and 12. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, And I, behold, I have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel instead of all the firstborn that open the matrix among the children of Israel. Therefore the Levites shall be mine, because all the firstborn are mine. For on the day that I smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I hallowed unto me all the firstborn in Israel, both man and beast. Mine shall they be. I am the Lord. So, in place of the firstborn of every family, he took Levi, which again is interesting because Levi is not the firstborn of Jacob. Um, but that was the trade. Everybody else got to keep their firstborns, and God took the whole tribe. Okay. Um, he goes on and talks about the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Remember, we're now jumping back in time. And from there, he talks about Kohath, the father of um, Moses, or excuse me, the father of Amram, the father of Moses and Aaron. And he goes on and talks about their sons. And he speaks of Gershon, who was of the family of the Libnites. And all of these are numbered according to all their males, but not for war. They're numbered so they can be given their assignments in the tabernacle complex and throughout the tribes when they go into the promised land. Okay. Um, then he charges all of the families of Levi. And then in verse 40, he begins the process of redeeming the firstborn. And so instead of all of the firstborn of Israel, God will keep the Levites, but he goes through a redemption process. He says in verse 46, and for those that are to be redeemed of the 203 score and 13 of the firstborn of the children of Israel, which are more than the Levites, thou shalt even take 5 shekels apiece by the poll. After the shekel of the sanctuary shalt thou take them. The shekel is 20 gerahs. In other words, all of the tribes of Israel had more firstborns than there were Levites. So God said, okay, I'll let you buy the rest of them, their redemption, for money. How does that settle with you? In other words, you don't just get to make an uneven trade and get off scot free. It's going to cost you something. Okay. Um, he goes on to talk about the Gershonites and their service. I'm sorry, he also talks about the office of Eleazar and the office of the Kohathites in chapter 4. Starts with the Kohathites, then Eleazar, then the Gershonites, then the Merarites, all of the families of Levi are given a place to serve in the tabernacle. Okay. In chapter 5, he's going to shift gears a bit and start talking about defilement and all the things that can bring defilement into the war camp or into the community of Israel. So he begins by speaking about those who have an issue or those who are defiled by the dead. He talks in this chapter about leprosy. He talks in this chapter about a defilement that comes from a person committing a sin, beginning in verse 7. And or actually, beginning in verse 6, and in verse 7, he speaks about confession. Okay. Um, he talks about lying with a woman and becoming unclean. He also speaks about oaths and fulfilling your oaths. In chapter 6, that interesting group of dudes known as the Nazarites. No razor was to come upon their face. They were not to trim their beards or cut their hair throughout the time of their service as a Nazarite. Some myths abound about the Nazarites among the people of God today. One of them is that a Nazarite was always a Nazarite for the rest of his life. Actually, that's not true. There was a vow of a Nazarite, and they would separate themselves unto the Lord, but it was generally true that a woman or a man who vowed a vow of a Nazarite would set a time limit on it. The common was 7 years. Okay? So the Nazarite vow was never intended to be permanent in most cases. There were a few whom God declared to be Nazarites from their mother's womb, but there were not many of those. But all the days of their separation, they were to remain holy and not to allow themselves to be defiled. That meant they could come at no dead body. That meant that they were unable to do the things. If you look at Numbers chapter 6, verse 3, no vinegar of wine, no strong drink. He could not even eat moist grapes or dried, no liquor of grapes. All the days of his separation, he couldn't eat anything that was made of the vine tree, from the kernels even to the husk. All the days of the vow, no razor. Okay? All the days he separates himself to the Lord, no dead body. His father dies, his mother dies, his wife dies, his sister dies. Well, sorry, you're out of luck. You can't go to the memorial. If a man dies very suddenly, he has to go through a cleansing process, including shaving and shaving his beard and his head. Okay. Um, Once he is clean again, he can return to his service as a Nazarite. Um, it's interesting that when he comes to the end of his Nazarite vow, he comes to the door of the congregation, he offers his offering, and you notice there's this part where it says, verse 18, and the Nazarite shall shave the head of his separation at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and shall take the hair of the head of his separation and put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offerings. You know what? You know what's interesting? That's exactly what Paul did. There's a record in the book of Acts that the Apostle Paul went into the temple because he had a vow and shaved his head. Paul was a Nazarite. And at the completion of his vow, after he had become a Christian, at the completion of his vow, he went to the temple and he performed this ritual. There's no other ritual that would require him to shave his head, no other vow he could have taken. In chapter 7, we see that all of the princes, who are also the war chiefs, all of these heads of the families of Israel, come and bring gifts to the Lord in wagons. Okay. 6 covered wagons and 12 oxen, a wagon for 2 of the princes, and for each one an ox, and they brought them before the tabernacle. Huh. Verse 11 says, And the Lord said unto Moses, They shall offer their offering, each prince on his day, for the dedicating of the altar. And then he goes through and he lists them. So we know Nashon from Judah, verse 12. 18. On the second day, Nathaniel, the son of Zuar, prince of Issachar. Chapter 7, verse 24. Eliab, the son of Helon, prince of the children of Zebulun, on the third day. It goes all the way through the tribes, ending on in verse 78. On the 12th day, Ahira, the son of Enon, prince of the children of Naphtali, offered. Every one of them brought their offering in, and then comes this interesting verse that ends the chapter on the gifts of the princes. Number 789. And when Moses was gone into the tabernacle of the congregation to speak with him, then he heard the voice of one speaking unto him from off the mercy seat that was upon the ark of testimony from between the 2 cherubims, and he spake unto him. Imagine walking into the temple, and Moses was no stranger to hearing the voice of God, but he walked into the sanctuary, the temple portion of the tabernacle, and he hears a voice coming from the Holy of Holies, and it's coming from the mercy seat itself, where the glory cloud of God rests over the mercy seat. Can you just put yourself in that moment? Because I have trouble doing it. Gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. In chapter 8, the light of the sanctuary is spoken of. He reminds them of the lamps and the candlestick and what they should do when they light the candlestick every day. And he reminds them that they, the Levites, are to be cleansed. Moses is told to wash them. And then they are told to keep themselves clean and to avoid any plague. What's interesting to me about this is it seems as though God is saying, Levites, priests, you are the lights of the tabernacle. You need to be holy. Even as the tabernacle menorah needs to have beaten oil, specially made, specially prepared according to instruction, so you guys are the light of Israel. You bring the light of God to the people of God. And Israel brings the light of God to the world. Um, Chapter 9, they observe the Passover. And he reminds them that when they go into the promised land, they are to keep keeping the Passover. Also, he mentions that Christophanic cloud, the Christophany of the angel of the Lord appearing in the cloud, a cloud by day and a fire by night. He brings it up and he points it out because the presence of God is what this is all about, the restoration of walking with God. And then in chapter 10, the trumpets of God in chapter 10 are enumerated, and they will be blown for the gathering of the people, and they will be blown to sound the alarm, and they will be blown to give the battle cry. And so he describes the in chapter 10 the silver trumpets, and he describes the first march as the people march toward Paran. Okay. In chapter 11, God's leadership is resented. Oh, more quail, more manna. So tired, so sick of it. So this angers Moses and it angers God, but Moses comes to God and he hears the people weeping and he says to the Lord, "Why are you doing this to me? Why do you keep asking me to carry these people like a nursing father?" A nursing father, that's just a weird illustration, right? I'm not even a woman. Why do I got to nurse these babies? Um, and he says to them, or he says to God, I don't have anywhere to get enough meat to feed these guys. And he says, kill me if you're going to keep doing this to me, God. Um, but the Lord says to Moses, gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel, and the ones that you know to be officers, bring them unto the tabernacle, and I'm going to have a talk with them. And God essentially sets the people straight. Okay. Um, there is a prophecy of Eldad and Medad, and then from Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, you see the quails are coming, and then there is a plague because God was angry with them. Um, and as if the people don't learn, now Aaron and Miriam decide they're going to challenge Moses. You probably read about this. Moses had married an Ethiopian woman, and they came and they were upset, and they said, is Moses the only one God talks to? Doesn't he also talk to Aaron? Doesn't he also talk to Miriam? I can't actually remember a specific example of uh, God speaking to Miriam, but that's what she said. And so God told Moses to bring them to the door of the tabernacle, and the cloud of the Lord came, and all of a sudden Miriam became leprous. And Aaron looked at Miriam, and she was a leper. And Aaron said unto Moses, we have sinned. And Moses cried unto the Lord, and his sister was healed. Yep. You imagine, I mean, we're coming to the place where right, we're coming to the place where they're about to send the spies into the promised land, right? Moses is about 80 years old. How old is Miriam? I mean, she was old enough to have chased Moses down the river when he was an infant. So what is she, 82, 85? Yeah, I can't believe it, guys, but we're almost going to run out of time, and we haven't even gotten halfway through the book. Um, so the second part of the book, chapters 13 and 14, are the rejection of the people of the promise of God because of their unbelief. We're going to need more than 4 minutes to talk about that, so I guess we will finish Numbers and hopefully Deuteronomy next Monday. And then we'll get into Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. Any questions or comments? Yes. Yeah, we actually had that conversation right before you came in. Yeah. So the handout for today is titled Deuteronomy, but it is actually up through Numbers. So, um, yep. And the Numbers document will be coming for next week because hopefully we will finish uh, Numbers and get into Deuteronomy on Monday. Uh, any questions or comments before we go? No. All right, guys. I will see you next week. You're welcome.